Welcome back to educator.com. Today we're going to go over unemployment, and we're going to look at some descriptions of unemployment, how to measure it, and what are the various different types of unemployment. So let's go ahead and dig right into the material here. So unemployment, we're going to introduce the concept of unemployment. What does it actually mean to be unemployed? Who is actually unemployed? I think a lot of people think that they're unemployed, but they're actually not part of the labor force. So we're going to differentiate between those two. We're going to review different terms relating to unemployment. We're going to work out some numerical examples relating to unemployment as well. Now again, they're not going to be very difficult, but just for the purposes of being able to figure out how the employment number is actually derived. We're going to examine the limitations of the unemployment rate. It's not the most perfect measure. Clearly there are things that don't accurately capture what's going on in the work situation. And then we're going to describe the different types of unemployment. In doing so, we're going to differentiate between the natural and the actual unemployment rate. And finally, for this one, I really like doing this because, sometimes the book only will talk about these theoretical models. What we're going to do for the final part of this section here, and I'll go ahead and emphasize this, we're going to actually examine data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and identify trends in U.S. employment. So obviously, again, depending on when you're watching this, this might be pretty outdated, but I chose a fairly recent example, and we can extrapolate some data. So I actually looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. So I use that as a source, and we're going to kind of examine, what's going on in the United States, taking a look at a snapshot of the current unemployment picture. So am I unemployed? So that's the question. Am I unemployed? So I have three different individuals, varying stages of life. One's 2, one's 70, and one's 35. And the question is, am I unemployed? We'll see, and later on we'll examine what the actual definition of being employed or unemployed would be. But let's take a look at Shiloh, a cute kid right here. Shiloh, a 2-year-old who spends his day playing with toy cars, train sets, and bobbleheads. Is he unemployed? Is he unemployed? The answer is no. I mean, I think most people would understand that he doesn't have a job, but there's really a difference between not having a job and being unemployed. I think it's clearly, if you're 2 years old, you're not looking for labor. And even if you were, you're not classified as being unemployed. Let's take a look at Peter. So Peter, a 70-year-old who is retired after working over 45 years in sales. Is Peter unemployed? And the answer to that is also no. Once you retire, you voluntarily take yourself out of the labor force. Now, just because you're 70 doesn't disqualify you from being part of the labor force. There are plenty of 70-year-olds still working right now, whether it's because they really have to or maybe they just like working. So they could be part of the labor force. But when you retire, you voluntarily take yourself out of the labor force and you're not considered unemployed. You're just not part of the labor force. And let's take a look at the final example, Grace, a 35-year-old housewife who chooses not to work despite having graduated from Stanford University in order to take care of her 2 kids, Jinhee and Stone. Is Grace unemployed? And the answer, once again, is no. Now, Grace may decide to enter the workforce later on, maybe when both Jinhee and Stone are old enough. But for all intents and purposes, she's just not part of the labor force. She's happily deciding not to work, so she's not unemployed. So technically, none of these three individuals have jobs, and yet they're not unemployed. If you included these people as being unemployed, then you wouldn't really get an accurate picture of unemployment. Unemployment rate might be something like 40% or 30%. And that's outrageously high. So keep in mind, unemployed, the definition isn't you don't have a job. So unemployed is a specific type of person that's looking for a job but is unable to find a job. So let's look at a little bit more specific measure on what it means to be unemployed here. So employed, what does employed actually mean? So these are people currently holding a job in the economy, and it can be either full-time or part-time. Now again, there's some people that are working 70 hours a week, some people that are working 10 hours a week. For the purposes of the unemployment rate, you are considered employed if you work, technically if you work 1 hour. So if you work 1 hour, you're employed. So you can already see that there might be some flaws with this unemployment rate here, right? What are some other terms? Unemployed, remember we know that Shiloh, Peter, and Grace are not unemployed. Unemployed are people who are actively, and that's the operative word, looking for work but have not found the job. So you really have to be actively looking for work, and then you're considered unemployed. So if you retire, if you're a housewife or a house husband, or if you're a kid, just because you're not working doesn't mean that you are unemployed. You have to actively be looking for labor. So that's basically what it means here. What does it mean to be part of the labor force? Well, it's easy. It's the sum of employed and unemployed. So if you're employed or unemployed, you're part of the labor force. So if you're retired, you're not part of the labor force. If you're a baby, you're not part of the labor force. And if you purposely take yourself out of the labor force to stay at home, you're also not part of the labor force. Now, labor force participation is simply the percentage of the population that's 16 or older that is in the labor force. So whether you're employed or unemployed, you take that number and you divide that by the total amount of the population, and that's a labor force participation. And finally, the unemployment rate is defined as the percentage of total number of people in the labor force, employed plus employed, who are unemployed. So there's basically two ways you can look at it here. So the unemployment rate is going to equal to the unemployed divided by the unemployed. So you take that same number you put on the numerator, but you add the employed. And then you multiply that by 100 because you get a fraction, right? So you want to find the unemployment rate. Well, how do you find what's another way of looking at the unemployment rate? Yeah, very simple here, but let's say you don't have access to the number of employed. Well, you can just take a look at the employed divided by the labor force, which is basically saying the same thing here. But just in case that you're not familiar with the terminology, make sure you multiply by 100. That's how you find the unemployment rate. You take the unemployed and you divide that by the labor force, or the unemployed divided by the employed plus the employed. Multiply by the number you get, the fraction, times 100. All right, so unemployment example. Let's say the population age 16 and older is going to be 2 million. So you have 2 million workers in the economy. So that's what you have here. And the labor force is 1 million. Now, part-time workers, let's say you got 200,000. Most are full-time workers, 700,000. What is the labor force participation rate? Well, that one's fairly easy here. So you got really nice, neat numbers there. So the amount of individuals that are actually working or want to work here. So we don't have the unemployed figures, but we just have directly the labor force. So it's the labor force divided by the population, 16 and older. And then you get easily 1 million divided by 2 million. So the labor force participation is going to be 50% here. So what is labor force participation good for? Well, if you have a very relatively low labor force participation rate, then that signs that the economy might be in trouble, right? Whereas if you have a very high amount, then that could be a good thing. Now, again, there are a couple of things, at least in the United States. The labor force participation rate in the past 50 years has gone up tremendously. A lot of women have entered the labor force. Again, that could be a good or bad sign. A lot of women are actually working because they want to, and that's generally a good thing. However, it could be the case that a lot of people are actually working to make ends meet. So you can look at different pieces of data and you can try to create a story here. But again, the labor force participation is higher in the United States today than it was 50 years ago. I think today it might be closer to maybe around 70%. and maybe between 60 or 70%. Again, depending on how the economy is doing. So every month it's going to be a little bit different here. So what is the unemployment rate? Again, two ways of doing this here. Well, you don't have the number of unemployed, but you know that the workers, so there's 900,000 workers, because they're either going to be part-time or full-time, and you know the labor force is 1 million. So 1 million. So you know the employment rate is 9 over 10. So 9 over 10 times 100 equals 90% 90% employment rate. So you take 100 minus 90%, and you're going to get the answer of 10% unemployment rate. Now, obviously, instead of subtracting the rate, you could take a million minus 900,000, you get the unemployed, right? But I just, figured, let's find the employment rate, subtract that from 100, and you get the unemployment rate here, 10% of the economy. All right, so what are some limitations? What are some clear limitations of the unemployment rate? So it's good to know, but just like any single measure, it's going to be imperfect here. So the unemployment tends to understate the employment situation because you are unemployed only if you have been actively looking for labor. And so there's a subset of individuals that are not included in the labor force if you haven't actively searched here. And these are actually called marginally attached to the labor force. Exactly how it sounds. You're not part of the labor force, so you're kind of in there here. Now, what does that mean? So you're not in the labor force. So you were available for work in the prior 12 months. So in the preceding year, you're actively looking for labor here, but you just did not search for work in the 4 weeks preceding the BLS survey. So marginally attached to the labor force includes a subset of the population that, if a job came and fell in their laps, they would absolutely take it, but they weren't active in the past 4 months. They may have been, 6 months ago, 3 months ago, but at least for the past 4 months, according to the survey, they were marginally attached to the labor force. So they weren't actively looking for labor. Now, within the marginally attached to the labor force, there's something called a discouraged worker. It's exactly how it sounds. It's a worker that's discouraged, except the discouraged worker here is just one phrase here. So it's a part of the marginally attached workers who give up because they believe no jobs are available for them. So they are completely given up on the economy. So if you have a lot of discouraged workers in the economy, it's not a good sign because people are saying they can't find jobs, so why even bother, right? So it's a very pessimistic outlook. So whereas unemployed individuals, they're actually looking for work. Discouraged workers, they throw up their hands in the air and say, forget it, I give up, I quit, I'm never going to find a job. So it's very not a good sign for the economy. So you can see that there are limitations of just looking at the unemployment rate. And maybe not as bad as a problem as the discouraged worker, you have underemployed. So workers who would like full-time jobs but are working part-time, or it could be someone who is overqualified for his or her job position. For example, Harvard PhD working as a cashier at McDonald's. So you're working at a place 20 hours a week, but you want to work 40 hours. Then you're underemployed. Or you spent 10 years getting a Harvard PhD in economics. The best job you can get is a cashier at McDonald's. I don't want to knock you. If you happen to have a part-time job at McDonald's, I think that's great, as a student, as a high school student. But I think most people agree that you don't go to get a PhD in order to work at McDonald's. And yet we have a lot of people in our economy that basically are maybe overqualified for their job position. So you have a combination of marginally attached to the labor force. You have discouraged workers, which is the most troublesome of the marginally attached. You have underemployed workers, and if they work 1 hour, they're considered employed. So you have this unemployment rate that you really have to take with a grain of salt, because you're gonna have to examine the data more fully to get the true employment picture in a particular country. So what are the different types of unemployment? So the first type is probably the most healthy, if there's any healthy unemployment. Tell that to someone who doesn't have a job, is frictional unemployment. The other two is structural unemployment and cyclical unemployment. But what is frictional? Let's go back to frictional unemployment here. So this is part of the natural, one of the two natural type of unemployment here. This is a process in which a worker spends to find a job, for example, a college graduate entering the labor force, or someone who has voluntarily quit his job. This is something that you're not going to be able to get because life happens. So let's say you go to Harvard University and you graduate with an economics degree, and for 3 months you're looking for a job. Well, you're going to be frictionally unemployed. Or let's say you've been working at Boeing for the longest time, and for some reason you decide, I don't want to work there anymore. So you voluntarily quit, and you decide, I want to become, an English teacher. Well, you're going to be frictionally unemployed until you find a job. So this is part of the natural job finding process, where you've said, frick, I've given up. I can't stand what I'm doing, and you give up and you try to find another job. You're frictionally unemployed. Again, the key is, in order to be unemployed, you have to be actively searching for labor. So if you quit your job and you cease looking for employment, then you're just not part of the labor force, right? Now, another type of unemployment is going to be structural unemployment. So this exists when the quantity of labor supplied exceeds the quantity of labor demanded, usually because workers lack the skills demanded for the jobs available, or again, the wage is artificially a little bit too high. So I'll give you an example of minimum wage and how that could actually increase structural unemployment. But let's say you're just not qualified for that job. Example that some textbooks use might be if you've trained all your life to be a telegraph operator, and that's all you can do. Well, you're not going to find a whole lot of jobs available in the telegraph industry simply because you lack the skills. Maybe even being a telephone operator, that job has kind of diminished with the rise of the internet. So if you lack the skills in the modern economy, then you are structurally unemployed. Now, the worst type of unemployment that economists generally consider as being very bad is cyclical unemployment. So this is a share of unemployment that occurs as a result of the business cycle or deviation of the actual rate of unemployment from the natural rate. So the natural rates would be the frictional and structural. So cyclical unemployment would be during economic downturns. So I'll just go ahead and draw a business cycle here. This is a very rough sketch here. So let's say you have real GDP here. I'm sorry, this is the real GDP would actually be on the y-axis. So you have real GDP, and then on the x-axis you have the years, right? So a business cycle generally is gonna see its ups and downs here. And again, notice the trend of a business cycle. It's gonna be kind of upwards here, right? Well, during this expansion phase, things are doing well. Where you're gonna see cyclical unemployment would be this contraction phase. So when you're dealing with a downturn in the economy, businesses aren't investing for whatever reason, then you're going to see this cyclical unemployment. When you hear about job layoffs, when you hear about, company closing down a factory, there's people aren't buying stuff, then this is where you see cyclical unemployment. And again, economists would generally consider this to be maybe the most troublesome part of unemployment. I mean, if you don't have a job, you don't have a job, but the idea of cyclical unemployment as being a really a bad thing in which the government, again, the Keynesian worldview is that it's the government's responsibility to step in when you see, cyclical unemployment, when you see unemployment as a result of a shock to the economy because of a part of the business cycle. So let's take a look at the effect of minimum wage on the labor market. Again, this might be a little bit more of a microeconomics review. So if you're also taking the AP microeconomics exam, this might be actually a good review to see the impact of a price floor. But this is a theory behind what's taking place here. So you have the demand curve and you have the supply curve here. Now, actually, one thing I actually made a mistake here, but just to prove a point, it's really not price here. When you're dealing with the labor market, what you want to put is the wage. And instead of S1 here, you might be able to put SL. Instead of D1 here, you might put DL. So demand for labor here. So you have an equilibrium wage, and let's call this W1 here, and this is the quantity of labor. And so let's say the equilibrium wage is, let's choose $7. And let's say you have a minimum wage. Now again, I actually live in California, and the proposed minimum wage eventually will increase to $10, which is higher than the federal minimum wage, right? Well, what happens when you have an equilibrium wage that's higher than, or when you have the wage that's higher than the equilibrium wage? Then what you have is the quantity supplied of labor. Everyone's going to want to work at $10 an hour. I asked my students, who here has a job? And what I found is over the years of teaching, the number of students that say that they have jobs has actually declined. Again, this is from my observation. Obviously, it's not a scientific process, but the couple of students that do have jobs, I in turn asked the students who here would take that person's job. And that person might be working at low wage McDonald's or minimum wage, so to speak. And a lot of students would be grateful to just take that job. In fact, I asked students, would anyone here work for $6 an hour, something below minimum wage? If it's a very easy job where, let's say, they're hired by Walmart simply to wave at customers. A lot of students actually raise their hands and say they would be willing to work, but they're technically not allowed to work here. And so there's a measure of unemployment where you have people who are willing and able to work, but they just can't find jobs because there's no demand for the labor. So that would be the economic term. Because if you're in the labor force, you are supplying labor, and if you can't find the amount of jobs, then the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded, and so this is an excess supply of labor. Excess supply of labor, and that's also a surplus of labor. And the way we look at the surplus of labor in economic terms, you have structural unemployment. Now again, there might be some pros and cons. I'm sure if you have a minimum wage job and there was no minimum wage, chances are you might lose some of your pay. But there's some people that are in favor of eliminating the minimum wage because that would serve to actually decrease unemployment. So whereas if you raise the minimum wage, and based on this supply and demand graph, you see that structural unemployment at least is probably going to increase. So what is this natural unemployment rate that I've referred to here? Because frictional unemployment is considered to be normal. When I say normal, unless you're the type of person that immediately after a job, you just keep on working. Some people, they quit their job and there's no guarantee that they have another job lined up for them. So this frictional unemployment is normal. And also some structural unemployment is seen to be as unavoidable in some economies. So economists have kind of lumped these two together here, and they've coined the term natural unemployment rate. So what is this natural unemployment rate? Natural unemployment is the frictional unemployment plus the structural. Yeah, easy to remember. The natural is the frictional plus structural. So anything beyond that is greater than the natural. So anything above and beyond would be unemployment due to a recession or downturn in economy. And so you have the actual unemployment versus the natural unemployment. So the actual unemployment is this natural unemployment, which is the frictional plus structural. The actual unemployment, you take this natural and then you simply add the cyclical unemployment. Or you can say that another way of saying the same thing except you're using different terminology is that full employment, which is when you have no cyclical unemployment, is a situation where there exists no cyclical unemployment, when the only unemployment that you have is natural or frictional and structural. So economists are definitely more concerned with cyclical unemployment. So if workers get laid off due to a soft economy and there's a lot of cyclical unemployment, this is the type of unemployment that economists generally view with more worry. Again, individually, if you don't have a job, you don't care why you're unemployed, you just want a job. But again, if you take a step back and you take a macro perspective, then the cyclical unemployment is going to be the more troubling of the three types of unemployment discussed. Yeah. So here's a quick example here. A person who moves to a new city. So let's say you're living in Los Angeles and you decide, I'm going to start over, and you're going to move to Austin, Texas. And you're still, again, remember, you're actively looking for a job. What type of unemployment is that? Well, it's clearly going to be frictional unemployment. Okay. And so why is it frictional unemployment? Because it is a voluntary situation. Okay, and it's a natural process. Again, it sucks not having a job, but it's considered to be normal. So what type of unemployment is created by a recession? Well, that one's really easy too. Cyclical. So remember, actual unemployment, UE, equals the natural UE plus the cyclical. So let's go ahead and take a look at the U.S. unemployment data to see, what are the trends right now, at least in the United States, for unemployment, and from that kind of analyze the unemployment situation so you have a better understanding of what unemployment is about. Again, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or the BLS. So the BLS, they're the ones that compile all the data on unemployment, and they report data on unemployment in the United States. So the website you can actually visit, www.bls.gov. So whenever you're watching this here, there's going to be usually monthly updated report, unless there's a government shutdown, which is becoming to be a common phenomenon in the United States. But let's take one example here. So in November 2013, so they report usually the unemployment the first Friday of every month. So for first Friday of December, they came out with the November 2013 unemployment rate. And basically the unemployment rate declined from 7.3% to 7%, with the total non-farm employment rising by 203,000. Now, again, in and of itself, it's hard to really analyze what's going on. If all you knew is that the unemployment rate went down 7.3 to 7.0%, then you'd say it's a great report. And also the 203,000, again, unless you have different figures, then it's hard to really compare. But basically, this was actually a very good thing. So for this particular month, the expectations were actually less than 203,000. Maybe I believe it was like $150,000. So the number of people that got employed was higher than expected, and in addition to the lowered unemployment rate, that was actually some positive news. Okay, now the unemployment rate among major worker groups is relatively unchanged. So men, the unemployment rate is 6.7%. Women, 6.2%. Teenagers, 20.8%. Actually, I believe this was white men, 6.7%. Women, 6.2%. Whites, 6.2%. Blacks, 12.5%. Hispanics, 8.7%. And Asians, actually 5.3%. The civilian labor force rose by 455,000 in November, after declining by 720,000 in October. So it's a good sign. The unemployment rate went down, but the labor force actually increased. So even though you're adding more people to the labor force, you're actually seeing a decline in unemployment. So at least for that particular month, it's a good thing. Now, if you actually look at the data, what were some of the reasons why? The return of furloughed federal government, furloughed federal government worker, in part was for the increase in the labor force. So the government had shut down for a period of time in October. So they account for the fact that they were now working in November. That accounted for a fairly significant portion, enough so that was mentioned in the press release here. So what you also have here, you're dealing with more data here. So in November 2013, 2.1 million marginally attached to the labor force, which it went down by 409,000. So in November 2012, so a year prior, you had closer to 2.5 million marginally attached workers. So it's a good sign when 400,000 workers are basically saying that, okay, I'm going to go look for a job. Now, some of them ended up getting a job and some of them are now unemployed, right? So of the 2.1 million marginally attached workers, 762 discouraged workers. So about a third are discouraged workers. And again, that's down by 217,000. So we had roughly 1 million discouraged workers in 2012, and it was reduced to 762,000. So again, these people might actually be unemployed now, but there's this argument to be made that it's better to be unemployed than it is to not be part of the labor force, right? So there is an argument for that. Now, what are other reasons why people decide not to join the labor force? It's not necessarily that they're discouraged workers. It could be that it includes school attendance or family responsibility. So there's other reasons beside, a bleak outlook on the labor market to not be part of the labor force, right? And again, other reasons could be retired or, disabled. There's different reasons to be not part of the labor force here. Another good trend is that the average work week increased from 34.4 hours to 34.5 hours. So people are working more. And I think the general preference for most people is going to be to increase the number of hours. Most people are probably not going to want to work part-time. Now, there's some people that are happy working part-time, but most people would probably want to work that full time here. Again, another good sign, generally positive employment report. The average hourly earnings increased 4 cents, from $24.11 to $24.15, with a yearly increase of 2%, which, again, 4 cents might not seem like a lot, but 2%, if you're making $50,000 a year, 2% is going to be $1,000 added to your income. So generally, some positive data coming out from that particular report. So trends in U.S. unemployment. Again, if you look at November 2011, okay, this was fairly bleak time here. You had the unemployment rate slightly under 9%. Now, if you go even further back, around the time of maybe the height of the recession, of the Great Recession, unemployment was actually above 10%. Maybe in right when Obama had been elected, the tail end of George W. Bush's administration, you had 10%, right? So you could make the argument, and actually when Obama came into office, it went even higher than that. You can make the argument that, okay, the unemployment rate has gotten much better. You clearly see the downward decline of unemployment. So our unemployment rate right now, as of the November, I believe, December actually went down even further from 7% to the December rate, 6.7%. So clearly the trend from 2011 and even further back, 2009 to 2013, there's been a downward trend in the unemployment rate. Okay. And again, if you want to look at the data further, if you look at the BLS numbers, then you can kind of see what's going on here. So the unemployment rate, the trend is definitely on a downward swing. And again, from a political standpoint, there are different ways you can manipulate the data. You can say the unemployment rate, you can kind of use that to kind of tell your side of the story. But again, it's not accounting for how many jobs are created. You're not looking at how many discouraged workers there are. So there's a lot of different factors. So the unemployment rate, beware of politicians that say, the unemployment rate has done this, because it gives you a little piece of the picture. So if you focus on that without regard to the other data, then you're going to get an incomplete picture, which is, what a lot of politicians, rightly or wrongly, that's what they do. Okay, so the unemployment rate. Is it possible for the unemployment rate, so let's highlight this, is it possible for the unemployment rate to increase and yet be a positive sign for the economy? Explain. Hopefully by now you have the tools to answer this. And the answer is yes. Okay. Now, how do you explain this? Now, are you going to see an FRQ question similar to this? Probably not, because not that it's not a good question. I think this is actually a really good question, but there's different ways that you can answer it. And again, on the AP FRQ exam, you're going to get a little bit more clear-cut right or wrong answers, and this is fairly open-ended. So, is it possible? How do you construct a situation? All right, let's say the labor force is 1 million. Okay. Employed is 800,000. Unemployed is 200,000. Okay. Population, let's say 16 and over, is going to be 1,500,000. So that's the data right here. So is it possible for the unemployment rate to increase and it be a positive sign for the economy? Well, let's take a look here. The unemployment rate given this situation here, you take the unemployed divided by the labor force. Okay. So you end up having an unemployment rate of 200,000 divided by the labor force 1 million, right? So unemployment rate is 20%. Again, in the United States, this would be awful, right? But again, everything is really relative. Some countries, 20% might actually be an improvement, right? So, is it possible for the unemployment rate to increase and yet be a positive sign for the economy? So, what we discussed is that discouraged workers, it's not necessarily a good sign, but it's not reflected in the unemployment rate here. So, a good thing might be, some of the 500,000 people that are not working, maybe they jump into the economy. So, what ends up happening is, let's add them over to this side here. Let's say, 200,000 people come in, and 200,000 are now 200,000 additional people are unemployed. So let's add a 200,000 right here, and let's say of those people here, let's say 100,000 people actually do find jobs. Okay, so what ends up happening is that 300,000 people enter the workforce. So the labor participation rate increases from 1 million over 1.5 million, which is 67%. Now you have 300,000 additional people that came in. So now you have 1.3 million over 1.5 million. So the labor force participation rate increased. So that's definitely a good sign. So the labor force participation rate increased, right? So that's a good sign here. But not only that, is it a positive sign for the unemployment rate to increase? So clearly, the unemployment rate went from 400,000, but now you add to the denominator, you have 1.3 million. So the unemployment rate is now going to be 4 over 1.3 times 100 here. So or 4 over, not 1.3, 4 over 13. Okay, now again, this is going to be a rough estimate here, so I'm not going to, so maybe roughly 28%. So the unemployment rate went up by 8%. So if you were only fixated on the unemployment rate, then this is a terrible sign for the economy. What you didn't see with just the unemployment rate is that 300,000 discouraged workers or people that were not in the labor force, marginally attached to the labor force, decided to join the labor force, of which only in this case, a third of them were able to find jobs, but they added to the mix. So in the United States, if the unemployment rate actually increases from 6.7% to 7% because people see that there's more job opportunities and therefore are more optimistic about the economy, an increase of the unemployment can actually be a positive sign. So increase in unemployment could be a positive sign for the economy. Now again, that being said, would I rather have a higher or lower unemployment. Again, the operative word here is could. Obviously, it's better if you have more people in the labor force with jobs, but again, that's the first step. And so when you just see the headline figure of unemployment rate going up or down, that's generally not enough. It's the context. So it's knowing what is unemployed, employed, was the labor force participation rate, how many discouraged workers. It's all about context, right? And so let's say, let me give you a kind of the reverse example. If, for example, the President of the United States, President Obama anointed me as the job czar. So forget about the political process. I am now in charge of all the jobs in the American economy, right? Let's say I'm not subject to any government scrutiny. Congress has no accountability. I am just part of, Obama's inner circle, and I can just create jobs. And my only mandate is to lower the unemployment rate, try to get as low as possible. Obviously, that's not necessarily the best goal, and we've kind of discussed one of the reasons. What would I do? And, I pose that question to my students, kind of, as a kind of food for thought. I want to see if students can kind of think outside the box. And I ask students, what would you do? And usually some students are able to pick this up, but most students will tell me, the best thing to do is try to create a job training seminar or do whatever you could to, get people more jobs, right? And basically it goes along that type of argument. But again, the way I look at it, if my only goal, and again, based on the way that the government calculates unemployment rate, if my goal is to reduce unemployment, what I would do is I would gather as many people into all the stadiums across the United States, and I would hire the anti-motivational speaker. So instead of telling them that they could get a job, I would hurl insults at them and say, you can't find a job. Why would you do that? Why are you even looking for a job? You're not going to be able to find a job. And I would just play this over and over and over again. Again, I know that's a terrible thing to do in real life, but again, if my goal is to lower the unemployment rate, then I will succeed, because what will end up happening, and hopefully you figured it out by now, is that what ends up happening is that the labor force diminishes. So these previously unemployed people, instead of there being 200,000 unemployed, I'm going to discourage maybe 100,000. Okay, so now instead of 1 million in the labor force, I might have 900,000 in the labor force. So the labor participation rate decreases, but guess what? I just lowered the unemployment rate. So again, a very terrible way to reduce unemployment. But again, if the goal, and again, this is probably not the best goal to have as an economy, if the goal is simply to reduce the unemployment rate, then you're not going to get the best way to get an economy moving again. Again, taken as a piece of the entire economic data, in addition to real GDP, nominal GDP, GDP per capita. If you're seeing inflation measures going down, unemployment going down, new jobs being created, then you get a better sense of the economy. But again, the unemployment rate itself is not going to be the most accurate measure of how the economy is doing. Thank you for watching educator.com.